March 18, 1925. A tornado touched down in the Ozark foothills of Missouri at around 1 in the afternoon and did not lift back into the clouds until nearly 4 hours later in Indiana, 219 miles away. It remains, a full century later, the longest continuous tornado track ever recorded anywhere on Earth. By the time it finally dissipated, it had killed 695 people, injured over 2,000 more, and destroyed entire towns so completely that some were never fully rebuilt in the same location. Here's what almost nobody knows. In 1925, the word tornado was banned from official United States Weather Bureau forecasts. Not discouraged, banned by official policy, out of fear that using the word would cause public panic. That meant that as this tornado carved its way across 3 states at highway speed, not a single town in its path received any kind of official warning that a tornado was even a possibility that day. This is the story of the deadliest tornado in American history, and the government policy that helped make it that way. To understand how a disaster of this scale could happen with essentially zero warning, you have to understand how primitive tornado forecasting was in 1925. Meteorology as a science was still relatively young, and the Weather Bureau, the predecessor to today's National Weather Service, operated under an official policy that actively avoided using the word tornado in any public forecast or bulletin. The thinking at the time, now understood to be badly mistaken, was that predicting a tornado was essentially impossible to do reliably, and that publicly forecasting one that failed to materialize would erode public trust in the Bureau, while forecasting one that did occur might trigger dangerous panic in the streets. So the word was simply avoided altogether, replaced with vaguer language about severe thunderstorms or high winds, even when conditions were clearly favorable for tornado formation. This wasn't a local oversight, it was national policy, and it meant that on the morning of March 18, 1925, even though atmospheric conditions across the Midwest were dangerously unstable, with a powerful low-pressure system dragging warm, moist Gulf air northward directly into a mass of cold air from Canada, the exact ingredients meteorologists today recognize as a textbook setup for violent tornado outbreaks, the public received nothing resembling a tornado warning. Farmers went about their morning chores, children walked to school, miners went underground for their shifts. Nobody in the storm's eventual 219-mile path had any official reason to expect what was coming. The tornado first touched down in Shannon County, Missouri, around 1 p.m., and almost immediately began exhibiting behavior that distinguished it from any tornado on record before or since. Rather than the classic, narrow, visible funnel shape most people associate with tornadoes, witnesses across its path consistently described something closer to a massive, rolling black fog, or a wall of debris, at times reported to be up to a mile wide, moving with such speed and density that many people didn't recognize it as a tornado at all until it was already tearing through their town. Some witnesses assumed it was an enormous dust storm or a strange, fast-moving fog bank, right up until buildings around them began disintegrating. The tornado's forward speed has been estimated at an average of 62 miles per hour, with some stretches reportedly reaching close to 73 miles per hour, faster than most automobiles of the era could reliably travel on rural roads, meaning that in many cases, there was no realistic way to outrun it, even if someone had recognized the danger and immediately tried to flee by car. By early afternoon, the tornado crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois, a crossing itself considered almost unheard of for a tornado to survive without weakening, and struck the small town of Gorham with a force that essentially erased it from the map. Witnesses described the town being leveled in what felt like seconds. Of Gorham's roughly 500 residents, dozens were killed, and the vast majority of the town's buildings were destroyed so completely that some accounts describe survivors afterward struggling to identify exactly where familiar streets and buildings had even stood, since so little structural debris remained in recognizable form. The tornado's single deadliest stop came at Murphysboro, Illinois, a coal mining town of around 12,000 people. In the space of a few minutes, the tornado killed 234 people in Murphysboro alone, making it, to this day, the deadliest single tornado strike on any American town in recorded history. Entire blocks of homes and businesses were reduced to splinters. Local hospitals, themselves damaged in the storm, were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of injured arriving faster than they could be treated. Fires broke out in the wreckage almost immediately afterward, sparked by overturned stoves and severed gas lines, adding a second wave of destruction to a town already devastated by the tornado itself, and complicating rescue efforts as survivors and rescuers alike had to contend with both collapsed buildings and spreading flame at the same time. Minutes later, the tornado struck Soto, Illinois, and produced one of the single most devastating individual losses of the entire disaster. The Soto school building took a direct hit while classes were still in session. Of the roughly 150 students inside, 33 children were killed in the collapse, along with several teachers, making it one of the deadliest school disasters in American history up to that point. Survivors described the roof and walls collapsing inward almost simultaneously, giving students and teachers essentially no time to react or take shelter within the building itself. The tornado's path also carried it directly through West Frankfort, Illinois, another coal mining community, at a time of day when a significant portion of the town's male workforce was underground in the mines. Miners who emerged from their shifts that afternoon came up to find their own homes and neighborhoods destroyed, in many cases having no idea a tornado had even occurred until they reached the surface, since the mines themselves offered no indication of what had happened on the surface above them during their shift. Several miners emerged to discover family members among the dead, having spent their entire workday completely unaware that their town had been struck by the deadliest tornado in American history while they worked below ground. The tornado went on to nearly destroy the small town of Parrish, Illinois entirely, killing a significant portion of its small population and destroying the overwhelming majority of its buildings, a level of destruction so total that the town's population and economic base never fully recovered in the decades that followed, one of several communities along the tornado's path that essentially never returned to its pre-1925 size or significance. The tornado finally crossed into Indiana in its final stretch, continuing its destruction through Owensville, Griffin, and Princeton before finally dissipating in the early evening, nearly 3.5 hours and 219 miles after it had first touched down in Missouri. By the time it lifted, it had crossed 3 states, destroyed or damaged an estimated 15,000 homes, and left behind a continuous scar of destruction longer than any tornado before or since has ever been documented to produce. Among the survivor accounts collected from Murphysboro in the years following the disaster, one stands out for how vividly it captures the sheer speed and disorientation of what happened. A coal miner's wife, home alone with her 2 young children while her husband worked underground, later described hearing what she thought at first was an oncoming freight train. A sound she said grew louder and stranger within seconds, less like a train and more like something roaring and grinding at once. She had just enough time to pull both children into a hallway before the walls of her home simply ceased to exist around her. In her words, not blown apart in a way she could process as it happened, but gone, as though the house had never been there at all. She woke moments later, lying in what had been her own front yard, one child still clutched against her chest, badly injured but alive. Her second child, only a few feet away when the house came apart, did not survive. She spent the following hours wandering through what had been her neighborhood, searching for anyone she recognized, later telling a local reporter that the hardest part wasn't the destruction itself, but the silence immediately afterward. Entire blocks where she expected to hear her neighbors' voices and heard nothing at all. Her husband, emerging from the mine that evening with no idea anything had happened above ground, learned what had occurred only when he reached the surface and saw the wreckage of the town stretching out in front of him. Accounts like hers are part of why survivors and historians alike describe the tornado less as a storm they watched approach and more as an event that simply happened to them, with almost no interval between normal life and total catastrophe. A speed of onset that, combined with the total absence of any official warning, left virtually no one in its path with any real chance to prepare. A school teacher in Soto is remembered for physically shielding several students with her own body as the school's roof collapsed, an act credited with saving at least a few of the children directly around her, even as the building came down, though she herself was seriously injured in doing so. A young telephone operator in Murphysboro stayed at her switchboard through the tornado's approach and its immediate aftermath, continuing to relay emergency calls for help even as the building around her sustained damage, and is credited by several later accounts with helping coordinate some of the earliest organized rescue efforts in the chaotic hours immediately following the storm, before any formal emergency response had been established. A group of coal miners in West Frankfort, upon emerging from their shift to find their town destroyed, immediately organized themselves into informal rescue crews, using mining equipment, picks, shovels, and their own physical strength built from years of underground labor to begin pulling survivors from collapsed buildings, well before any outside emergency assistance arrived. Their mining experience with structural collapse and confined spaces proving unexpectedly useful in a disaster none of them could have imagined preparing for. When the tornado finally lifted for the last time in Indiana, the final toll stood at 695 people dead across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, making it, by a wide margin, the deadliest single tornado in United States history, a record it still holds a full century later. Over 2,000 people were injured. An estimated 15,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. Total property damage was estimated at roughly $16.5 million in 1925 terms, an enormous sum for the era, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. The tornado's 219-mile continuous track remains the longest ever officially documented anywhere in the world, and its average forward speed and overall intensity have led modern meteorologists, using retrospective analysis, to classify it as an F5 on the Fujita scale, the highest possible rating, for significant portions of its path, meaning wind speeds likely exceeding 260 miles per hour at its most violent points. The disaster became one of the most significant catalysts in the history of American severe weather forecasting. In the years and decades that followed, the Weather Bureau's ban on the word tornado in public forecasts came under increasing scrutiny and criticism from meteorologists who argued correctly that withholding a specific actionable warning in the name of avoiding panic had directly contributed to a death toll that better forecasting communication might have significantly reduced. The policy wasn't formally abandoned for decades afterward. Tornado forecasting and public tornado warnings, as most Americans understand them today, didn't become standard practice until the 1950s, nearly 30 years after the tri-state tornado. But the disaster is widely cited by historians of meteorology as one of the clearest early arguments for why specific, honest, actionable public warnings, even at the risk of occasional false alarms, save far more lives than vague, cautious language designed primarily to avoid institutional embarrassment. One detail that separated this tornado from nearly every other tornado on record was not just its unusual width and unheard of forward speed, but the way those two factors combined to eliminate almost any margin for human reaction. A typical tornado, even a violent one, tends to move at a fraction of this storm's pace, giving people at least some window, often just minutes, but sometimes enough to seek shelter once they realize danger is approaching. At an average of 62 miles per hour, with witnesses in several towns reporting the storm arriving with almost no visible lead time between first noticing something unusual on the horizon and the destruction reaching their own street, there was often no meaningful gap between awareness and impact at all. Survivors in multiple towns independently described the sensation of the sky darkening and the storm arriving what felt like almost simultaneously, a compression of warning and disaster that meteorologists studying the storm decades later have pointed to as one of the primary reasons its death toll climbed so much higher than tornadoes of comparable or even greater intensity that have struck since, when modern warning systems have typically provided at least some lead time. Beyond DeSoto, several other schools along the tornado's path were struck during class hours, since the storm's early afternoon timing coincided almost exactly with when children across its path were seated at their desks. In multiple towns, teachers made split-second decisions, some ordering children under desks, others attempting to move students toward interior hallways. Decisions made with essentially no warning and no established tornado safety protocol to guide them, since organized tornado drills as a standard part of American school safety training did not yet exist in 1925. The losses among school children across the tornado's full path, when combined across every town it struck, represent one of the single deadliest days for American school children from any cause in the country's history. A grim distinction that, much like the disaster itself, remains largely absent from broader public memory of the era. In the hours immediately following the tornado's passage, railroad telegraph lines, which ran through many of the affected towns and represented some of the only reliable long-distance communication infrastructure of the era, became a critical lifeline for getting word of the disaster to the outside world and requesting emergency assistance. Railroad workers in several towns are credited with using company telegraph equipment, some of it damaged and requiring improvised repairs, to send some of the earliest calls for medical supplies, doctors, and relief workers to nearby cities, effectively functioning as an emergency communications network in the absence of any dedicated disaster response infrastructure. In several accounts, railroad personnel also used available locomotives to transport injured survivors to hospitals in nearby towns whose own medical facilities had not been damaged, converting freight and passenger cars into makeshift ambulances in the disaster's first chaotic hours, well before any organized state or federal relief response had time to mobilize and reach the region. A full century of tornado tracking, using tools and technology the storm chasers and meteorologists of 1925 could never have imagined, including Doppler radar, satellite imagery, and dense networks of ground observers, has still never produced a tornado that matches the tri-state tornado's continuous 219-mile track. Some modern researchers have questioned whether the storm was, in fact, a single continuous tornado the entire distance, or possibly a family of several tornadoes spawned in rapid succession from the same parent storm system, a debate that persists in meteorological circles even today, given the limitations of eyewitness-based damage surveys in an era before any kind of continuous instrumental tracking existed. Regardless of which explanation ultimately proves correct, the storm's official designation as a single tornado and its record for both length of track and death toll have both stood unbroken for 100 years, a grim testament to just how far outside normal bounds that single afternoon in March 1925 truly was. Murphysboro, Gorham, DeSoto, Parrish, and the other towns along the tornado's path were rebuilt to varying degrees in the years that followed, though several, particularly the smaller communities like Gorham and Parrish, never returned to their pre-1925 population or economic significance. Their populations and local economies permanently altered by a single afternoon in March 1925. Murphysboro, as the site of the single deadliest tornado strike in American history, maintains a memorial to the disaster, and the event remains a defining part of the town's collective memory, even a century later, marked periodically with commemorative events on its anniversary. The tri-state tornado exposed something the country had never fully had to confront before at this scale: that an entire government agency's caution, however well-intentioned, could leave hundreds of towns and tens of thousands of people functionally blind to a threat that modern instruments, even primitive ones, were already showing clear warning signs of that very morning. The tornado didn't kill 695 people because meteorology in 1925 was incapable of seeing the danger coming. It killed that many in significant part because the institution responsible for warning the public had decided, as a matter of policy, that the risk of causing panic outweighed the risk of staying silent. A century later, that calculation has been completely reversed. Modern tornado warnings are issued as early and as specifically as possible, precisely because of disasters like this one. The deadliest tornado in American history didn't just carve a 219-mile scar across 3 states. It quietly rewrote the rules for how this country talks to its own people about danger.